We all know that bass on small speakers can sound pretty awful. On phones especially, under 100 Hz, you often can't hear anything whatsoever. So why is that, and what can we do about it? Notes in the real world are made up of their fundamental frequency, which give them their names, C, D, E, F, G, and so on. Then there's a series of harmonics, and those harmonics we call overtones. And they're the things that provide the note with their characteristics. These overtones add the richness and definition to a note that we call timbre. In the real world, they're very complex, and they're created for all sorts of different reasons. One would be the way that a string vibrates. For instance, it doesn't vibrate in a perfect curve. If it did, it would sound very much like a sine wave and be reasonably boring. They're influenced by what the instrument is made of, how big it is, etc. Sometimes we're faced with a bass within a mix that simply doesn't have enough of these upper harmonics or overtones. And when that's the case, it's very hard to make it heard, especially on small speakers. What do we do about it then? Well, this is what we're going to talk about right now. Okay, so let's take that sine wave and have a look at it in a spectrum analyzer. The movement you see at the bottom represents the noise floor and is not part of the sine wave per se. I'm now going to play this sine wave through a plugin called Pedal in Ableton Live that generates distortion. If you're onto it, you'll notice that the dry wet is set to 0, which means that none of the signal is passing through its architecture yet. Because even with no distortion added, that generates higher noise floor. I'm playing the sine at 41 Hz or slightly above, which is the pitch of an open E string on a bass guitar. You can see it represented by the single round peak. You'll note that it's pretty hard to hear because it is simply the fundamental and has no complexity, which means that it's hard for the human ear to define at that frequency. It does, however, have an awful large amount of sub-energy in it, and that's why we tend to use sine waves for the subparts of most synth basses. If I play it an octave above, you'll note that you can hear it much better. It's clearer still an octave higher, and so on until you reach the other extreme, where again it becomes harder to hear until eventually the limitations of our ears or the audio equipment render it inaudible. I'll now bring up the dry wet amount to 100%. Still, no actual distortion is being generated, although you can see that a couple of smaller peaks are being created by the noise floor of Pedal, which increases because of its inherent architecture. So I'm now going to slowly bring up the gain amount on the OD algorithm. OD stands for overdrive, incidentally, and you will immediately see harmonics being added, and with each one generated you can hear more and more definition and complexity. You'll note that if I change it to one of the other algorithms, distort or fuzz respectively, even more harmonics are added and the sound becomes more complex still with far more definition. Of course, if you add too much, you can cause more problems than you fix, and just to be clear, there are other ways of doing this, but that's for another day. Here it is in a more practical application. Notice how it starts off largely ambiguous and becomes more defined as harmonics are added via the algorithms of Pedal. So what am I saying? Am I saying that if you add a shitload of distortion to all of your basses, you shall be a happy hobbit? Well, no, it's more complicated than that. One of the problems with distortion units in the real world and as plugins is that they can often destroy your sub-energy, and that's a real no-no. Saying that Pedal in Ableton Live is pretty good. It's got that little button called sub and a bass boost that really work and seem to protect your sub-energy. But the best of both worlds is being able to have full control over our sub-energy and our upper harmonics. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways in which we can do that. In both, we split the frequency spectrum using filters, and we affect both sides of that separately. One is good for both MIDI and for audio, and the second is pretty much only good for MIDI. But in that context, it's actually more convenient, and that's why I'm showing it to you. Here I'm using Ableton Live, but all DAWs have a method for accomplishing the same idea. Leave a comment if you need help. I'm using a sine wave from a synth to play some bass notes on a loop. I've grouped the synth for something I'm going to do later, but you can ignore that for now. My loop starts on E at around 41 Hz. You'll note that it's not very clear, and even if you've got headphones on, it'll be quite hard to hear. If you're listening on a phone, you've got no hope. I'm now adding an EQ and setting the first band to a low-pass filter at a steep slope. I've typed in the frequency at 100 Hz. This will be our sub-bass and will remain unprocessed. Now I'm duplicating the whole track and changing the EQ in this instance to a high-pass filter whilst leaving the frequency at 100 Hz. Now I'm adding an overdrive distortion plugin to the track and making sure that it's placed before the EQ. This is super important because unless the low frequencies are allowed to pass through it, it won't have any signal rich enough to generate higher harmonics from. Now we add some drive and perhaps experiment with the other algorithms such as distortion or fuzz, or whatever you've got on your particular plugin. Set it to an appropriate level and mix the subchannel in to taste. All that's left to do now is to group the two channels so that one fader can adjust the both of them at the same time, allowing for comparative volume adjustments. Now we have complete control over the amount of sub-energy as opposed to that of upper harmonics, giving us a fat sub-bass that is still audible on smaller speakers. So here's another method that I call parallel instrument stacking that most of the main DAWs can do. At least I know that Ableton Live, Reason, Studio One and Logic all have a method of doing this, even if they're implemented differently, and I'm confident that many, if not all of the others do as well. It only works for MIDI, but it's also far preferable for MIDI because it means that you can use MIDI data from a single track to power both instances of your instrument. The clean sub version and the affected harmonically rich version, which helps make the bass audible on smaller speaker systems. In Ableton Live, I have already set my wavetable synth to a group by right-clicking and selecting the group command. You can also use the shortcut Command-G or on Windows Control-G. In Reason, this is called combining, and others have their own protocols, I'm sure. Now I drop in an EQ, making sure that it becomes part of the device group like this. Then I set the first band of the EQ to a steep slope high-pass filter and set the frequency to 100 Hz. I now duplicate the whole device chain by clicking on it and using the key command of Command-D, Control-D on Windows. You can also use the right-click context menu. I'm setting both volumes to 0 dB. Now I drop in my distortion or saturation plugin, making sure that it's placed before the EQ, and then I set the first band of the EQ to high pass instead of low pass, leaving the frequency at 100 Hz. Now I start my MIDI track, and both of the synths start to play, but not at double the volume as you'd assume, because one is playing below 100 Hz and the other above. And because we have the highest slopes set on our EQs, there is very little crossover. Now is a wise time to reduce the volume of the second instance, which we intend to distort, so that it doesn't blow your head off when we do. And then it's time to bring up the gain and watch the harmonic richness grow. Different tracks require varying amounts of drive, but that's largely up to experimentation and taste. You can, of course, add subsequent processing to mold the sound even further.